Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I'm going to be painting up the Space Wolves Assault Intercessor. This was a super fun model to paint, so let's get into it. Before I primed up this model, I added some 3D Wolves 3D printed bits to this model to make an out-of-the-box regular Space Marine Assault Intercessor look more like a Space Wolves Marine. So I added some decorations around his knee, a Viking loincloth thing, and an axe on his back waist here. I got these bits from GreyTideStudio, which makes awesome bits to add onto your Warhammer minis. So starting out, I primed him black, and then after that was good and dry, I started working on the base armor color with AK Interactive dark blue gray using 2 thin coats. Next, I'm going to move to a sponging technique to build up some volumetric lighting. This is a technique that I really enjoy doing since I don't have an airbrush, and it also adds nice subtle texture onto the armor that I really enjoy. So mixing our base color of the dark blue gray and Pro Acryl's blue gray into a 50-50 mix, and then ripping off a piece of foam from a makeup wedge, I'm going to start applying some paint to the sponge, dab off the excess, and then I'm going to start dabbing it onto our model. I'm concentrating on applying this to where the light would be shining down on the model as if our light source is above. So I'm applying the paint to the model on the more exposed armor sections and leaving the more covered sections as our base armor color to roughly simulate light and shadows. Then I'm going to do the same thing, but just using Pro Acryl's gray blue. Now I use this more conservatively, but looking back at it now, I might have applied a bit more. The reason why is that our wash layer is going to knock down the color a little bit, so going a little bit brighter may have been a better idea. But that's also personal preference. After using the sponge, I'm going to break out the brush, and I'm going to start adding in some edge highlights and scratches. With edge highlights, I do think that less is more, and really only concentrate on adding highlights to where I think they're really needed, while keeping volumetric lighting in mind as well. Next, let's start working on the red. I'm using some Mephiston red here on his right pad, and I'm also going to apply that to his knee pad and his left pad as well, because on our left pad we're going to build up to the yellow that I'm going to use. And for that yellow, I'm going to be using Moon Yellow from Vallejo. Now, yellow is not one of those colors that can be difficult to get a nice smooth finish on, it's just the nature of the pigment. So be sure to really make sure that it's mixed well, and maybe thin it down a little bit more than you would when you start applying it. Moving on to his head, I'm going to keep it simple and just rely on a base color and then use our wash to bring in the shadows and details. The color I'm using is Vallejo's Pale Flesh. For basing our leather elements, I decided to go with a less saturated leather color, so I'm using Dryad Bark. But if you wanted to use a warmer tone of leather, I like the recipe of a base color of Rhinox hide, and then after washing using Mournfane Brown and Scrag Brown for the highlights. I'm also going to be using Dryad Bark for his hair, loincloth, and the handle on his axe. Next thing I'm going to work on is painting our pistol, chainsword, and between the armor paneling with black. Let's move on to getting some metallics onto the model. I'm going to base coat most of the metal sections on this model with Cobalt Metal by Warpaint Fanatic, which has a subtle cooler tone of metal that I really like. For the Aquila and other small metal bits, I'm using Runelord Brass. Now, I should have done this before our metallics, just because if you don't switch out your water, there will be some tiny metallic flakes that could latch onto your brush when you go back to regular paints, and they could transfer onto areas where you don't want metal flakes. But I'm going to base out the skulls on his loincloth and the wood handle on the axe with Rakarth flesh. Then, using Mechanicus Standard Gray, I'm going to add some edge highlights to our pistol and the chainsword. Next, I'm going to put on a coat of matte varnish onto the armor and shoulder pads, moving around our metal elements because I don't want to get those covered in it. This step is totally optional, but I like doing it to kind of protect what I've done already, but I really just like the finish that it gives. And after that is dry, I'm going to apply some decals to the shoulder pads. After we have our transfers applied, which I do recommend putting some kind of varnish on the decals to protect them, let's start adding some weathering. Going back to our base colors for the shoulder pads, I'm going to start adding tiny little scratches and chips onto the transfers. Going back to using a sponge, and I'm going to add some chips onto the armor. I'm using Rhinox hide because I have it, but if you wanted to use dried bark just so you don't have to get another paint color, that'll be totally fine. During this step, be sure to start off light and build up to what level of damage you want. It's easier to apply more than it is to go back and fix it if you've added too much. And here we have our model so far with all of our base colors on. Take a moment to clean up any sections that may need it because it'll make for a better end product. I kind of overlooked this step, so if you look closely, I have some paint spilling over on sections where I didn't really want it, so just take a moment to clean everything up. Now for the fun part, let's wash this bad boy. Using a 50-50-ish mix of Winter Streaking Grime and Mineral Spirits, I'm going to brush this all over the model, making sure to get complete coverage. After it is sufficiently covered, I'm not really going to wait. I'm going to get a Q-tip, I'm going to lightly dampen it with some mineral spirits, and then I'm going to go start gently removing the excess grime. If you're first doing this, it may seem a little daunting. You may not know how much to remove, and it's hard for me to tell you exactly how much, but I also think it comes down to personal preference. After a model or two, you should start getting the hang of it, and you'll have a good feel for when you need to stop and get the outcome that you want. After you work it with a Q-tip, you can either let it air dry, or you can use a hair dryer to speed up the process so you don't have to wait long to continue working on it. This is also a good time to maybe take a small break, get some water, stand up and do some stretching because I hunch over super hard when I paint, or play a nice relaxing game of Dota.
Run! Run! Oh, run! Yes! No!
Just kidding, Dota's not relaxing. After everything is good and dry, I'm going to break out our black wash, and I'm going to thin this down a little bit and start using it mostly as a recess wash to bring out a little bit more detail on our model, such as around the rivets on the armor, between armor sections to separate them a little bit, or you can also use it to bring out more weathering by dabbing a small amount onto a section, and then immediately I just take my finger and gently smush it down on top. I don't know, I think it just makes a nice little splotch. I'm also going to thin it down almost to a glaze consistency and create a subtle shaved sides to his head, but just glazing it from the base of the helmet up to the side of where his hair is on the top. And then I just do this in layers to build up to the shade that you like, so he's not completely cleanly shaved bald mohawk. Next, I'm going to add some edge highlights to our metal elements by going back to our cobalt blue and stippling some onto the edges where I want it. Same thing can be done using Runelord brass onto our brass elements. Here he is so far. He's getting closer to being done, so let's press on. Let's work on our leather here. I'm going to use some Gorthar Brown to start off our highlights and scratches, and personally I like to thin this down a little bit more than usual, and I like to use as thin of paint lines as I can to build up the texture and scratches on our leather. And then doing the same thing, though being more conservative with it, using Carrick Stone. Last step for our model is adding in some rust. Now I like using rust. I don't care if it's like lore accurate or not. I just, I like how it looks. So I'm using dirty down rust here, and just like with some of our other weathering techniques, I like to start small, and then after it dries, I like to evaluate it, and then start building it more to get the right amount that I want. To completely wrap up this model, I'm going to create a super simple snowy base for him. I'll just start by adding a grass tuft and then using Citadel's Valhalla Blizzard to start adding it onto the base, and even adding a bit to the boots and loincloth ends to make the model look more a part of his environment. There are more complex ways to make snow bases. I just wanted to keep this super simple, but I think it looks pretty solid. And that is it. Looking back at it now, taking a little bit more time to clean up the base colors before adding the wash would probably be a little bit better. Also think going a tiny bit brighter with our blue highlights on the armor to make the detail stick out a little bit more would have been good, but overall I really enjoy how it came out. Thank you everyone for stopping by and checking this video out. Even if you don't like it or didn't learn anything, at least I hope it inspires you to paint your models. Like with all the models I paint, there is no one way to do it, and I encourage everyone to check out other methods to build up your toolbox of painting knowledge. I also have a Reddit and Instagram that I'll post the links to in the description. Apparently you can follow people on Reddit, so that's something. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.